Most modern readers expect stories to be like real life. In the mid-19th century, however, a realistic story was considered radical and was even criticized. Despite this outcry, several famous American writers persevered, and in doing so, they initiated one of the most enduring movements in literary history, realism. Realism in literature refers to writing that offers an accurate and detailed portrayal of actual life. It's also the literary movement, first started over in France in like the mid 19th century, and then it spread to England and to Russia, and then ultimately to the United States. Now, it was born as a reaction against Romanticism. Remember Romanticism? This is the idea that artistic and literary movement glorifies the individual. It celebrates things like emotions and imaginations. And this was dominating literature during the 19th century. But unlike the Romantics, realists didn't want to glorify anything. They simply wanted to depict reality, no matter how ordinary the characters or their circumstances. In basing their literature on careful observations of commonplace events and people, these realists could sort of shed light on greater social issues and concerns. Where did this come from? So, in addition to it being a reaction to Romanticism, it was also sort of a feature of the times. By the end of the Civil War, 1865, America was moving. It used to be a predominantly rural society, and it was becoming a more urban one. And so it was experiencing the effects of the Industrial Revolution. In addition, because people were moving into the cities, more and more of them were going to school and they were learning to read. So you've got this rising literacy, and now realists found a much broader audience than writers of previous time periods. There were more people to read their stuff. So there were a lot of folks writing about these sort of dramatic social changes that were happening to the average citizen. First one we're going to talk about is we've got Mark Twain, we have William Dean Howells, and my personal favorite, Henry James. So in the following decades after they started writing, the realist movement sort of spread, and it spawned several related movements, such as naturalism. We also have this idea of regionalism, and we've got a lot more sort of local color becoming included. And we'll talk more about those individual movements as they come up. Okay, so what is realist literature like? Well, first you have this idea of verisimilitude. Verisimilitude is a fancy way to say sort of truthiness, right? It's the appearance of being true or real. And realist literature is famous for the way it tries to create a world that seems very real, very true. It's believable. In fact, it's described as sort of true to life as possible. Realist writers take great pains to get their facts straight. They were influenced by journalistic techniques at the time, and you're going to see that in the writing. Now, it might seem like the writing kind of drags on for a little bit, and this is because there is a lot of detail. The novel was a great place because you could put a bunch of detail in a piece of writing. And so, writing of this time is going to have a lot of specific facts and probably more detail than you might see in other works of literature. Another thing to keep in mind about realist literature is that it's quotidian in nature. Now, this is just a way to say it focuses on ordinary, common events of daily life. And so what you're going to notice is that the writers here, they're going to focus on complex characters because ultimately what happens is that sort of character exploration and development becomes more important than plot. Right? It's the people and their internal workings matter more than the story's conflict or its beginning, middle, and end. You're going to kind of consider the ethical choices that arise through the individual analysis of character. And you'll also take a note at the diction. What's going to happen is realist writers are going to create dialogue that sounds like the way people naturally speak. It's going to capture sort of the dialects and the idioms of conversation that you wouldn't see in more formal writing. So, to understand the different perspectives and the subject matters of Romanticism versus realism, consider these two prose examples. Take a moment to read them and see what the differences are that you can depict between the two. Another thing you might notice when you start to read more realist literature is that the way the subject seems a little bit different. Realist writers adopted the scientific method of a sort of detached observation. Now, this allowed the narrator of a story to sound unbiased, kind of distant, as if simply recording the complete facts of the stories. And the reader can then draw his or her own conclusions. So, what you're going to see a lot is sort of this third person omniscient point of view because it seems to be a little bit more objective. All right, take a look at this example here. Notice the detached perspective of the narrator and the detailed description in this passage. In this case, we have an omniscient narrator. The narrator knows everything and can be everywhere at once, can even jump between locations and the minds of different characters. So again, as you read, pay attention to the point of view. How is the narrator removed from the story? Finally, a thing that will come up again and again, and what's probably the most important element of realist literature, is the social themes that it addresses. The literature of realism sought to explore key issues of the time, right? What are the implications of modern technology? What are the effects of urbanization? Realist themes are typically concerned with things like class conflict, urbanization, marriage, family life. Remember, people were getting closer and closer together as they moved into cities and as society became more urban. And writers were exploring how our environment and how groups of people influenced each other. Take a look here. In the novel The Rise of Silas Lapham, author William Dean Howells, he tells a story of a family, and they're coming to terms with new wealth and acquisition and a little bit of corruption. In this particular passage, Howells relates the family's initial responses to their newfound wealth. Take a moment to read what's happening here. So as we move through our next unit, be thinking about how realist literature is different than the reading that came before it. In particular, think about what the writers do, how they write, and what they include as a way to mimic reality in a way that is perhaps truer than what came before.